Hi, this is Kate from MinuteEarth. Not to be confused with 1985's Hurricane Kate. Only my parents can call me that. Anyway, in case you weren't tipped off by that disastrous intro, today we're bringing you 4 stories about extreme weather, starting with this piping hot video.
The Earth has a lot of warm places. Forest fires, lava flows, iron foundries, the inside of your toaster oven, nuclear reactors, and so forth. But if we're just talking about regular old sun heats the Earth climate and weather, where on the Earth's surface is hottest? Some might say Death Valley, which isn't a bad guess, as the 56.7 degrees Celsius temperature observed 100 years ago at aptly named Furnace Creek remains, according to official weather statistics, the highest temperature ever recorded. However, weather stations measure air temperature in the shade about 1.5 meters above the ground, and as you know if you've ever walked barefoot across a beach on a hot day, surfaces in direct sunlight can be a lot hotter than the air just above them. Plus, there are only 11,119 official weather stations scattered across the globe, which equates to only one station every 13,000 square kilometers, or 6 on average for an area the size of Scotland. Not that Scotland is a leading candidate for heat waves. Super hot places like deserts are particularly harsh and remote, making weather stations impractical and even less common. So to find the true hottest place on Earth, we need an army of meteorology students to install and monitor thermometers on every inch of the planet. Or we could measure the temperature of the Earth from space, which NASA does every day. The Terra and Aqua satellites carry instruments called spectroradiometers, which detect the infrared radiation, that is the heat, radiating from the Earth's surface. Their resolution isn't amazing since the satellites measure temperature averaged over each square kilometer of the globe, but that's still 13,000 times better than weather stations. So, the winner for hottest square kilometer on Earth? Not Furnace Creek, it only clocked in at 62.7 degrees Celsius, nor the scorched wheat plateau in the Lut Desert of Iran, despite repeated claims to be the hottest place on Earth. However, it's close. A nearby portion of the Lut Desert is the winner at 70.7 Celsius, or 159.3 Fahrenheit. That's 1 degree hotter than you need for the proteins in an egg yolk to coagulate, that is, to cook. No need for your toaster oven, breakfast is served.
Now that's a hot day I don't care to experience. But that breakfast did look excellent. Next up, a rising tide carries all boats, but the news isn't quite so good for those of us on land.
Over the millennia, city dwellers have found lots of effective ways to protect themselves against invaders. But the forces of nature have been harder to keep out, especially because most cities lie along coasts and major waterways. In 1362, a storm aptly named the Great Drowning of Men wiped out a string of European settlements, killing more than 25,000 people. In the centuries since, low-lying places like the Netherlands have developed an impressive array of water defense systems, including vierden, dikes, ditches, dams, locks, and picturesque water pumps. And in the mid-20th century, the Dutch began building an ambitious series of storm surge barriers that are among the largest movable human-made objects in the world today. But with sea levels projected to rise by as much as 1 meter in the next 90 years, and 3 more meters in the following century, it's clear that even the efforts of the Dutch won't be enough. Nor is the Netherlands alone. Cities all over the world face similar threats, not only from rising seas, but also from warming waters that are brewing stronger, scarier storms. Since keeping all of this water out may simply not be an option, people around the world are getting creative. Inventors in the UK have created thirsty concrete capable of soaking up 600 liters of water per square meter every minute and funneling it away. Dutch engineers are designing floating homes and shopping centers that can bob along on rising seas. And who knows, the storm-driven waves that threaten cities today might one day provide enough energy to power them. Floods of data are changing how cities deal with storms too, helping model where a storm is most likely to hit and visualizing where evacuations might need to occur. We've also gone back to our roots. Salt marshes and mangroves in tidal zones can reduce wave height and total wave energy by more than 50%. Research shows that combining these natural features with engineered ones could avert hundreds of millions of dollars worth of storm damage in coastal urban areas such as New York's Howard Beach. But so far, cities are far from fully storm-proofed. We still need to gather more information and develop more solutions to make them as resilient as possible. It's a good thing urban areas are innovative hotspots where great ideas are constantly flowing. They just need to flow out faster than the water can flow in.
So we're going to have to do a lot more to figure out how to keep our heads above water in the coming years. Speaking of which, if you've ever bought flood insurance, or any kind of insurance really, you've probably heard the term acts of God. But what does that actually mean? And what does butter have to do with anything?
In 1903, an unprecedented flood struck Kansas, wreaking havoc on homes, farmland, infrastructure, and an entire trainload of butter. The creamery sued the rail company for its lost cargo, but the railroad argued that they shouldn't be responsible, since the flood had been completely out of their control. The court agreed, ruling that the flood had been an act of God. Courts around the world have actually been using the term since the 1500s to describe unprecedented events that seem to come out of nowhere. Today, you'll see acts of God mentioned in contracts, insurance policies, and a few US environmental laws. And like in the butter case, you might hear a lawyer milking the term as a defense in court. To use the act of God defense, you don't have to prove that a god actually caused the event. You just have to prove two things. One, that taking reasonable precautions couldn't have prevented the damage. And two, that the damage was caused by a natural force with no human influence. But it's getting harder and harder to meet these criteria, starting with the reasonable precautions. Thanks to improving technology and scientific knowledge, we're increasingly able to predict the size, scope, and path of destructive events, which raises the bar for what kind of reasonable precautions might be required to stave off damage. For instance, back in 1903, the railway had put the butter car on what seemed like high enough ground to keep it safe, but they had little way of knowing how severe the flood would be. Today, with a lot more flood knowledge, they'd have to better prepare the butter for the act of God defense to stick. And the second criteria is also harder to meet because we're finding that an increasing number of natural disasters do have human fingerprints on them. For instance, human activities have led to the warming and rising of the ocean, which almost certainly intensified Hurricane Sandy in 2012 and likely exacerbated Europe's 2015 heatwave. In fact, scientists estimate that some of Sandy's catastrophic effects, like the flooding of vital transit tunnels, which added more than $10 billion of damage, might not have happened without the effects of human activity. Since natural events like floods, droughts, and wildfires are happening more often and doing more damage than they used to, we may actually be seeing more act of God cases pop up in court in the future. But because we're becoming better at predicting those events and recognizing our own contributions to them, the success of the act of God defense may soon be relegated fully to the margins.
Okay, no matter what you spread on your bread, we can probably all agree that that ending pun could have been better. One thing we can't all agree on is how we actually experience extreme weather in the first place. Take a look.
Is the weather getting weirder? Your answer probably depends on the weirdness of the weather you've been experiencing lately. For example, after the UK got doused with one of its rainiest weeks on record, the Brits who reported experiencing flooding were much more likely than their drier compatriots to say that they'd noticed wetter and wetter weather over the course of their lives. And before a withering drought struck the American Midwest in 2012, only 41% of residents thought they detected a long-term uptick in the frequency and intensity of dry spells. But after that one desiccating summer, 66% said they'd been seeing worsening droughts for decades. Rain or shine, our minds tend to prize their freshest impressions. But even when we experience the same weird weather events as other people, we don't always agree on how weird they actually were. Data from more than 4,000 meteorological stations tells us that the winter of 2012 was the third warmest on record in the US. But according to the Americans who lived through it, well, those who thought of global climate change as a serious man-made threat were significantly more likely to report that their local winter weather had been warmer than usual. Even after adjusting for beliefs about global warming, there was a political divide, with Democrats more likely than Republicans to rate the winter as unusually toasty. Clouding the issue further, these days we get less of our weather information firsthand and more from the media, where different channels compete for our attention by mentioning extreme weather far more often than they used to, and spicing up not-so-apocalyptic events with terms like polar vortex and snowmageddon. The Weather Channel has even co-opted the World Meteorological Organization's practice of naming destructive tropical storms by christening every biggish snowstorm that trundles over North America. With so many sources of information, it's easy for us to choose the ones that align with our broader worldviews, no matter what they are. As a result, much of what we hear about the frequency of extreme weather can end up reinforcing what we already believe, rather than giving us new information about what's really going on. So, Did this video tell you what you wanted to hear?
And with that, I'm off to broaden my worldview, come hell or high water. And finally, you may have noticed an alarming trend among our stick figures: baldness. 100% of stick figures inevitably end up bald, unless we take action, with a few precisely applied digital marker strokes. Baldness also affects real-life humans, too. According to this video's sponsor, Keeps, more than 2/3 of non-stick figure men start losing their hair before the age of 35. If you're a no hair, don't care kind of guy, awesome. You know we're fans. But if you're not into the stick figure look, instead of curing male pattern baldness with a marker, which doesn't work nearly as well in real life as in our videos, you can at least partially prevent it with regular treatments of minoxidil, like the ones you can order from Keeps. And now you can prevent both types of baldness. When you order a subscription at keeps.com/MinuteEarth, you'll not only get 50% off your first order, but we'll also donate digital hair to an otherwise cue ball stick figure.